Churches all over the place, and all of them have these white images. Everything is white. Nothing to indicate there was an African presence anywhere in the land. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about, first let's look at the land and try to get some kind of perspective on what Israel was like during the Bible time. Abraham. Who is this Abraham? Where does it come from? Let's talk about it, and let's hold the land of Canaan and Palestine in perspective. If you can give us some overview and background.
I want to approach it in several different directions. One is, since it's the one we're most familiar with, the biblical direction. And in the book of Genesis, when it goes over the genealogies of human beings, according to the Israelite view, it says that Ham, who was noted as the ancestor of the Africans, and we're not going to deal with the curse of Ham here now, because that was not in the original Genesis record. We're just going to deal with Ham as a great ancestor according to Hebrew tradition. That his sons were, he had 4 sons, and they were Cush, Mizraim, Punt, and Canaan. Now, Cush, we know, came to be known as Ethiopia. Cush, the Cushite empire spread all over the world. But that was the Hebrew name for them. They probably had another name for the Nuba, was the proper name for the people. Nuba, because they came from Nubia. The Mizraim was the Israel Hebrew way of saying Kemet, or as the Greeks later called it, Egypt. And Punt was their way of saying Puanet, which was Somalia. And Canaan was that on the Palestinian Strip. Now, interesting thing about Canaan is that Canaan is right there at the tip of the Fertile Crescent. Now, the heart and center of that Fertile Crescent is in the Nile. That was the richest producing soil in the world at that time. So why many people wanted that Palestinian strip of the land of Canaan is because of the wealth there at the tip of it. This biblical version lets you know that the Canaanites were in fact descendants of Ham, who everybody generally agrees were African people, Africoid people. The word Canaan itself is describing they're also called Phoenix, which describes a red, purple, or mahogany colored people. That's what Canaan and Phoenix mean. The two words are synonymous. Now, this strip was very vital because whenever the Asian would attack Africa, they would have to cross Canaan to get to it. And whenever the African was going to repel the Asian, or to stop the Asian in their tracks, or to conquer Asian territory, they would go across that bridge. Now, the Hebrews who came in the days of Abraham, and I want to get this clear understanding, there was no Hebrew in the world before Abraham. And the proper term is Harabu, as Dr. Yusuf Benjo-Channon writes in African Origin of Major Western Religions. And it meant one who had crossed over the river. And that is because Abraham came from a place called Ur of Chaldea, which was the remnants of the ancient Sumerian Empire, the land of what they call the blackheads, or the black-headed people. They were very black people. He came out of that land. Now, we assume that he was a black man, but even if he wasn't, his descendants spent over 430 years in Africa mating with Africans, and was only 77 of them under Jacob who went there, and they come out 3,160,000 strong in Egypt. Yeah, or what they misnomer Egypt, in Kemet, but what the Bible calls Egypt. So, but we can, I think, safely assume that Abraham was indeed a black man. He originated from Ur of Chaldea, not out of the sky, not of any place else. And also, just to put a footnote here, the oldest bones, the oldest remains dating about 50 to 70,000 years that have been found in Palestine, where Canaan was, in the Palestinian Strip, are Africoid in all their features. From the osteological study It shows dolichocephalia, the long head, steatophagia, the big ample posterior. From the bones we can tell all of that. The platyrinia, the broad nose, the thick lips, all of these are Africoid features. These are the oldest features in the land. At that time that Abraham was traveling out of Ur of Chaldea, the Europeans or even the Eurasians had not settled in any significant amount in the land. They had made incursions and attacks, but they had not settled. And one of the reasons why Abraham was leaving Ur of Chaldea was because the word was out that the Scythians were going to attack that land again, what is called Chaldea. They were going to attack that land. The Greeks called it Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. Now these Scythians were Indo-Europeans who, when they went to battle, they went buck naked wearing a black cape. And the first person they felled in battle, they bit them in the neck and sucked the blood out of them to get their power and strength as a symbol of their conquest over that person. Now they had attacked Chaldea 200 years earlier, and Abraham heard the devastation that they brought. So he knew that they were coming in, so he decided to leave. Now in order for him to settle in Canaan, he had to go to the nation or the empire that had control over that land at the time, that was Kemet. So he had to go into Kemet and get permission from the officials, not the Pharaoh, because Abraham was not of a status that he could stand before the Pharaoh and speak to him. You had to be a world dignitary to do that, and he wasn't. He wasn't even a tribal leader yet. He didn't even have a good clan at present. He wasn't even a chieftain at this time. This was in the year approximately 1675 BCE. That's before the Common Era. This is the first Hebrew anywhere that gets permission from the Kemetans, and he goes and begins to settle with his family in Canaan. Now, it's doubtful that he had over, we would be generous to say he had 20 people in his family at the time. So that is the beginnings. Now, he has a son called Isaac, and Isaac has a son, and he also has a son called Ishmael. He has Isaac by Zerah, who is from Ur of Chaldea, a black woman, probably, on all probability. We know that Hagar is a black woman from out of Kemet, because Kemet was predominantly black people. There was no more than 10% or 11% white population there at any time, and that was mostly during the days of the Greeks, and this is long before the Greeks come. And he had two sons by these two women, and Isaac had Jacob. And in the days of Jacob had 12 sons who became the patriarchs of the 12, what later became the 12 tribes of Israel. These are all black people we're talking about here now. Now, Jacob is living in Palestine at a time, according to the Genesis record, of famine strikes. And so he has to go to the place that has the most abundance of food. Everybody's flocking to that place at that time, and that's Africa, the continent of Africa, to Kemet. So he goes to Kemet and settles there. And his family, and it's only 70 to 77 of them when they go in. I want you to understand that. It's only 70 to 77 of them. In all probability, they were black people. We have no doubt about that. But even if they weren't, when they went in only 70 to 77, and they come out, they stay there in the Nile Valley for 430 years, according to their records. Now, there's no record of them being enslaved. And had they been enslaved, had there been that many slaves there, they would have, because they came out over 3 million strong, had they been slaves, it would have been recorded, because the Kemetans recorded everything. Even if they hadn't recorded it, Persia would have recorded it, India would have recorded it, because they were recording everything in the world there. They were literate people. But they come out, the Bible says, the Exodus record says, that they come out 600,000 men, plus women and children. The average family consisted of 5 children at that time. They had a lot of children. Many of them had several wives. So we can safely estimate it's 3,100,000 and some odd thousand coming out there. They are essentially African, with an African religion, because their leader at the time is Moses. And Moses is described by Jethro's daughters as an Egyptian. They don't describe him as an Asian or anything. They describe him as an Egyptian. And the Egyptian was noted for their dark color and their Africoid features. And this is happening around 1200. This is about 400 years after Abraham has been there, almost 500 years. This is happening around 1200 BCE. And Herodotus, the Greek historian, not the father of history, one of the first Europeans to record history, but not the father of history, he says in his day, which was around 450 BCE, that the Kemetans, or the Egyptians as they called them, were jet black people, just like the Ethiopians and the Chaldeans. So they were now, 800 years later, still jet black people. So when Moses, when the Jethro's daughter see him, they describe him as a black man. Also in the biblical story, it says when Moses is receiving his call at the burning bush, and he is reluctant to accept the call, then he is told to put his hand in his bosom, and when his hand comes out, it's white as snow, and it frightens him. Then when he agrees to answer the call, he's told to put his hand back in his bosom, and it's back like it was before. Now, if it was white when he pulled it out and it turned back to its original color, that should tell us, give us some indication that the man was not a white man. That he was obviously a black man, as was most all of the Israelites at that time were black people. Now, as time went on, there were constant invasions from the north in Israel, as there was in Kemet and in India and Arabia and other places, where the lighter races began to dominate the north and drive the darker races further south. So there was this admixture going on, this miscegenation by force of a conquering force. However, the Hebrews were generally reluctant to mate with people outside of themselves, even other black people, often outside of themselves, their tradition and their religion. Their prophets were very strict about that. Now, it isn't until the days of the Greeks that we get this very light population beginning to come in, but they're not dominant. And the Greeks come in about 300 BCE, and then of course the Romans follow them in 30 BCE. And that's when you start getting a light-skinned population, but still they're predominantly dark-skinned people. Now, when Jesus appears on the scene, he is of the tribe of Judah. And of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel, Judah is the navy blue-black tribe. Now, how do we know that? When you go back in the book of Genesis, you find that they are mixed with Hittite, Jebusite, all kind of ites. And Dr. Justice taught us in the seminary all those ites were black because all of those ites came from Ham and came from Canaan. And Canaan was the son of Ham, and the ites were the grandson of Ham. So according to even the biblical record, these are obviously Africoid peoples. Now, the Jesus, a tribe of Judah, maintains more of its color. Some of the other tribes are a little mixed, like we are today, from chalk to charcoal, they as a result of invaders. But the tribe of Judah produced the kings. And in order for you to become a Christ or an anointed one, you had to come out of that tribe, and that tribe had to maintain more closely than any other tribe its genetic features, physical features. The very word Christ itself is from the Indian word Krishna, as Joel A. Rogers tells us, which means the black one, the anointed one. To be anointed as a Messiah, you had to be kissed of the sun. You had to be a child of the sun. This was tradition throughout the whole ancient world. So here Jesus comes now, born of the tribe of Judah, and obviously a very black man when you trace his lineage. When you look at the 2 birth certificates of Jesus, and his proper name is Yeshua, because there was nobody named Jesus. That's not a Hebrew word. Yeshua, meaning God will deliver us, or our liberator. The same as in the Old Testament, they call it Joshua. When you look at the 2 birth certificates, one in Matthew and one in Luke, and you trace his lineage, you find all these Africans in there. You find all these Hamite, as they call it, the quote-unquote, use white folks' term, Hamitic tribes, because there was no difference between the Shemites and the Hamites. They were of the same racial stock. In fact, the Bible says very clearly, in Amos, the 9th chapter, in the 7th verse, it says, "Are ye not as the children of Egypt and Ethiopia unto me, O Israel, which was bespeaking the fact that they were the same racial stock. Now, another reason we know that Jesus was a black man is that the most ancient, the oldest icons of Jesus shows him as an African. And probably the most noted one is in the British Museum, and there are many, of the coin minted by Justinian II in the 8th century of the Common Era, or what is sometimes called the Christian era. In the 8th century, by Justinian II, Emperor Justinian II of the Roman Empire. And what it has on one side of the coin is a man with obvious Africoid features, kinky hair, kind of corn-rolled looking hair, broad nose, thick lips. And it has in Latin, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. On the obverse side of the coin is an alpine-looking person with the straight hair of the European and Europoid features. And it says Emperor Justinian II. So you can clearly distinguish who is who. This is in the British Museum even unto this day. Joel A. Rogers has printed it in his books. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima in his Journals of African Civilization has printed it. And it's been shown in many other works, scholarly works. Now, getting back now, when the Romans come, going back in time now, when the Romans come in 30 CE, or BCE, I'm sorry, before the Common Era, and take power from the Chemitans in the days of Cleopatra VII, they also take Palestine and they take Syria and several other nations in that area. This white nation, this European nation now, begins to dominate the indigenous people in Palestine and in that part of Africa known as Egypt, there in the Nile Valley. When they do this, there is constant resistance, especially on the part of the Israelites. They're constantly involved in warfare to fight against them. And there were always these messiahs rising up that the Romans had to deal with. So what you have essentially is a white power, European power, dominating a black nation on its own land. And this power had as its symbol the eagle. It also had as its governing body the Senate. The same as you have in the United States of America today, which is merely an extension of the Roman Empire. Now they were oppressing these people on their own land. In the day that Jesus ben Joseph was born, or Yeshua ben Joseph, the one we know the most, because there were so many men named Yeshua at that time. In the day that he was born, he became one in a great line of messiahs whose purpose was to prepare his people to be delivered, primary purpose, from the Romans. Now, often in Christian theology and mythology, they have you thinking that Jesus was totally detached from the political activity going on in the land. That would have been impossible for him to do and get the attention of the masses, because the masses' primarily concern was to get liberation from the Romans. His very name bespoke that. Thou shalt call his name Jesus, or Yeshua, because he shall save his people from their sins. Which meant we think they're talking about saving them from committing adultery or something like that. It's talking about the word sin as used in the New Testament and used in the English language today comes from the word which means imbalance. And when one is being enslaved by another, especially in their homeland, that is an imbalance. So they would be saved from their imbalance. That is what they were looking for. They weren't looking for any other type of deliverer, and he couldn't have gotten the masses out had he been talking about anything other than that. When the Romans crucified him, they didn't crucify him for teaching nonviolence. They did not crucify him for starting a new religion. The Romans couldn't have cared less about somebody starting a new religion, because they had so many in the empire already. It didn't make any difference. One new one didn't make another god. That's all it was. What they were concerned about was he stirred up the people. That was a charge brought against him, even in the New Testament. And what they arrested him for and what they crucified him for was daring to call himself a king, the king of Israel, which was political office. And the Romans said that the only king that could exist in Israel as long as they had power in that land, as they were dominant in that land, was someone whom they had appointed. And therefore, they crucified or assassinated him on the cross for that reason. No other reason. They didn't have anything. They didn't care about him being the Savior of the world. They never even thought about anything like that. Now, after the death of Jesus, assassination of Jesus, the movement which he helped to perpetuate, it had already been started, but he really carried it to the fore. It was called the Nazarene Party. There was no such thing as Christianity when Jesus was alive. Even in the book of Acts, it tells you they were first called Christians in Antioch. This is well after the death of Jesus. This is when the Apostle Paul and his Barnabas goes there, that they are called Christians. Now, it was called the Nazarene Party. And one of the main contingents of that party was the Zealot contingent. They were the fighters, the soldiers who fought against the Romans and led all kind of insurrections against them. And he had several of them among his disciples. So what he was trying to develop was what we would call today a black united front. Because we find in the Nazarene Party, if you read your New Testament very carefully, you'll find in the Nazarene Party that you had members from the Pharisee Party, from the Sadducee Party, from the Zealot Party, and from the Essenes. He was covering all bases. So he had a united front there. Now, after his death, for a while it brought confusion. And then Peter and James and John took over the leadership and stirred up the masses once again. Then they were in turn killed. They say Peter was crucified upside down, and others were, most of the apostles met with some type of martyrdom. Well, after this now, the struggle goes on for independence of Israel. There's another person comes along whom they would call in the Latin language Jesus, another Yeshua, and this is Yeshua ben, let me make sure I got him right. Is this Ben Elia ben Kakba? Yeshua ben Kakba is the next one to come along and to lead a revolution as a Messiah. See, we think there was only one man named Jesus or Yeshua. But in Jesus' day himself, when he was a little boy at 12 years old, there was Yeshua, or as we would say, Jesus ben Judah, who had led a revolution and was crucified. And when Jesus was 12 years old, to get home in Nazareth, he had to walk up a road through several thousand crosses of Israelites hanging on the cross, and at the head of it was one whom you would call in today's language Jesus, son of Judah. So he had that experience at 12. He himself had the experience, Jesus, son of Joseph, just using the Latin language now. And then after him, there is Jesus ben Kakaba, who leads a revolution. Then there's Jesus ben Menachem, who leads another one, and which goes now, Jesus, the one that we talk about, is crucified about 30 of the Common Era. They assassinate him. The movement is still going on and continues to build. The Nazarene Party continues to build. And I'll tell you where you can get good information on that. Dr. Hugh J. Schoenfield. He's a Jewish writer. He does a very good job on it. 2 books. 3, as a matter of fact. And they are The Passover Plot, The Incredible Christians, and The Jesus Party. Those are essential books for having an understanding of what was going on historically. Now, he doesn't put it in an African-centered context. We have to do that. But he gives you a good historical overview of what was taking place. We try to detach Jesus of the Bible from history, and you can't do that because he was a part of that history. The same as that people would come along later and try to detach Dr. King from the history and the movement that was going on in our time, or carrying on our time, or to separate Malcolm, to just take his philosophy and separate him from the actual movement that was going on. You couldn't do that logically. But when the European Christians took over, which we're going to get to in a minute, they were able to do it by force of arms. Now, a groundswell arose until by 66 of the Common Era, the Romans said, we tired of these black folks down there in Israel constantly rebelling. We got to stop this once and for all. It's getting out of hand. So Titus brought his troops into Palestine to attack Jerusalem. He was called back by, was it Vespasian? I'm trying to think of the name of the emperor at that time. He was called back to Rome. So he stopped short. He had laid siege to Jerusalem, but he stopped short of conquering it. And at that time, the Nazarenes and the Zealots thought that they had the upper hand. And they were chasing the Romans out of the land. So they thought they had won. So for 4 years, they thought it was all over. We're getting rid of these Romans. The Romans come back in 70 under Titus. And this time when they come back in full force. And they come back with the baddest legion in the Roman army. Unfortunately, Africans, the 10th legion, called the leopard men. They used Africans to conquer African people. That's exactly what they did, a methodology used by Europeans all the time. They burned down the city, totally destroyed. I mean, they laid it to siege. Over 100,000 people died. Where blood flowed as high as a horse's halter in the streets, they say. People were eating each other by the end of it. Many of them did escape. Most of them went back to Africa, the origin where they came from. Some went up into Europe and became the later known Jews. Many went up into India and became the Khazars, what they call the 13th tribe. Those that went into Europe became the Ashkenazi and hooked up with the Germans. They were African when they got there, but after much admixture, they were more German than they were African. Now, at this time, the Romans are totally dominating the land. The capital of the Israelites is just burned down. Not one brick is left upon another. They just burn it down to the ground. That's all there is to it. It is not even considered the Holy Land at that time. Those Hebrews that are of the diaspora, they look to it. They look to their homeland there, especially the ones who are in Egypt. And that's where a lot of your gospel writing goes on then, those who settled in Egypt. At this time, there's still no Christian movement. You still have Nazarenes continue to fight even up until 135 of this era, and the Romans only finally stopped this movement almost totally at Masada in 135, yes, at the fort built by Herod. After that, Palestine is nothing in the eyes of the world. Christianity is focused now in Rome because the Roman, let me correct that. It is at this time focused in Africa, where the original Christian churches developed, in Carthage, which they call Carthage, and in Alexandria, and then down in Ethiopia. That is where your Christian powers and your church fathers and your saints at that time are Tertullian, who brought made the Latin language the language of the church, Latin language which actually was mostly Punic at that time, an African language, which Hannibal the Great spoke. And after him came Augustine. Origen came after him. Cipriani, Augustine, Perpetua, all of these were Africans there who were the bishops of the church. Now, you had some churches in Rome, and the Romans were here and there, but the strength of the church, the African church, still maintaining its African consciousness and culture, is in Africa. Not having the political force it had as the Nazarene party, because it had to start playing a lot of that down to keep those Romans from beating up on them. But they are strong. They're going strong until the Romans decide that it is just too costly to keep taking them to the Colosseum and feeding them to lions and to keep killing them. There's only one way to deal with this thing. And this happens now in about 311 of the Common Era. Constantine the Great, they call him. His mother, I'm trying to think of his mother's name. It's not Monica. I'm trying to think of his mother's name. It doesn't come to me. Is converted to Christianity. And she says, you got to stop killing these people. You got to stop killing. By this time, it has been Europeanized and everything. It's using a lot of its Africanness and its original meaning. It continued to be a strong force against invaders of Africa for a good while. Even after the Romans took it over, it was a strong force against invading Arabized Muslims for a long time, as Dr. Chancellor Williams points out in The Destruction of Black Civilization. Now, but I'm running a little ahead of myself here. Well, Constantine then becomes converted, and he says this. He says, I want all of you bishops of these various churches to meet with me at the Council of Nicaea, which is now in Turkey, in the year 325 of the Common Era. Because at that time, Christians were going into the arenas, the very arenas that the Roman, Imperial Rome had used to feed them to the lions and to crucify them and burn them at the stake, and they were going in slaying each other over which gospel was the right gospel and which gospel wasn't, and which form of Christianity was the right one and which was. I mean, there was a lot of splinter groups going on, and they were fighting each other. Constantine said, we have to have one codified system of belief. So he called these bishops together, African bishops included. It was at this time that the African church lost control. The African bishops who went to the Council of Nicaea, at the head of that group was Arius. And at the Council of Nicaea, the European bishops, 310 of them, said, this is what we're going to believe, and this is what we believe, that Jesus was born of a woman without the aid of a man. Now that was not even imagined before this time. That he is not only the Son of God, but he is one and the same essence with God, therefore is God. He did not have a wife and children, which was utterly insane. Because every record, every other gospel said that he had wife and children. Some said he may have had 2 wives. Because you have 4 gospels in the New Testament now, but you had at least 70 in circulation at that time. Gospel meaning good news, and was another term for biography on the life of Jesus, is what it was. Now, they took the 4 gospels they could best edit and bend to the system of belief and doctrines they wanted Christianity, Eurocentric, let me be very clear on that, Christianity to adapt. Arius and the African bishops from Carthage and from Alexandria and from Ethiopia, they stood and said, no, this is not true, what you're saying. And the European bishops said it's true if we want it to be true, and we have the army of Constantine to back it up. And if you don't agree with it, get out. So they ran Arius and the Africans out of the council. They had to go up in the mountains to find refuge, to keep from being killed. And they led their struggle from there, which somehow spread up into Germany. Arianism went all the way up into Germany somehow, and was a constant struggle with European Christianity. It was then that the Roman Church took over, and that the power began to be transferred from Imperial Rome to Papal Rome. Still, Palestine is of no significance. This thing they call the Holy Land is still of no significance. It's concentrated, the church was concentrated in Africa, now it's being concentrated in Rome. A political movement started by an African in Palestine is now taken over, and its headquarters is in Rome.
Where was the headquarters in Africa?
It was in Jerusalem. Oh, and in Africa, it was in Alexandria. The church at Alexandria, and I'm trying to think of the one in Ethiopia, the oldest one there, the Coptic church, and I cannot think of the city. Aksum, that's right. The city of Aksum, the oldest there, and Carthage, what they call Carthage. Those were the centers of Christianity at that time. Because Jerusalem was gone, man. So this was the center. When the Romans took it over, the African church almost essentially kind of cut itself off. And it didn't even look to Rome anymore until they were attacked by the Arabs. That's when they asked the Romans to come help them. Now, it is It continues to grow in Rome, but it doesn't have the power and force in Europe it wants to, because the rest of the tribes in Europe, because at that time there was no England, there was no France, there was no Germany, there was Gauls, Britons, they were tribes. They didn't have any nations then, and they had been controlled by the Roman Empire for a long time. In fact, one of the greatest emperors who brought peace to the wild Britons for over a century was Septimius Severus in 198 CE. And he died, as a matter of fact, in Britain from the cold up there. He was an African emperor of Rome who refused to eat Roman food. He had his food imported from Africa because he had to have the spice of it. And he spoke Latin with an African accent. And he was African in culture. And went back to Kemet into Egypt to visit there so he could learn about his ancestors, and had the bones of Rome's worst enemy dug up and buried in a marble and gold sepulcher in the center of Rome itself, the bones of Hannibal, of Carthage. This is the audacity this black man had. But he was such a great general. He controlled the army, and whoever controlled the army in Rome at that time was the emperor. Well, he died about 211, I believe. And then now we get back to Constantine, which is 325. We come back up to that. After Constantine, several other emperors come along. The empire had fallen apart. You had the Eastern, the Byzantine Empire in the east, and you had the Western Roman Empire, which was much of nothing. It was in the year 538 CE that the Roman army, directed by the Pope of Rome now, not by the emperor, the Western Roman army directed by the Pope of Rome, finally felled the last Arian resistance in Europe. And that was when they took the power from Clovis, who was a Gaul, and that made the Roman Catholic Church the dominant power in all of Europe at that time. Now, mind you, this church, which was supposed to be walking in the shoes of the fishermen, did not come into power with prayer. The Holy Ghost didn't bring it into power. It came into power with the sword. When Constantine said to them, whatever you decide, I'm going back to 325 now. I know I keep jumping back and forth. He said, whatever you decide, that will be the doctrine of Christianity. And I will back it up with the army. So, consequently, what we believe about Christianity today was not brought about by Jesus, was not brought about by the apostles, was not brought about by God. It was brought about by the army of Constantine and perpetuated by the Roman armies in support of the Pope once he took power completely. Now, a new power came on the scene that had to be reckoned with. A new star arose in the east. A black man with frizzly hair, jet black man, as Joel A. Rogers tells us, born to the Quraysh tribe in Arabia, became a prophet of a new religion called Islam. And one of the main people in Islam, as the prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah said, whose father was al-Matalib, his grandfather, a jet black man. The third part of Islam was Bilal ibn Hazrat ibn Rahab was his name, Bilal, who was a servant at first to the Prophet Muhammad and then became an equal partner. It was Bilal who developed most of, and a lot of Muslims don't like to admit this, the theology of Islam, the theology of paradise. You get the 70 black virgins if you die in jihad. If you're brave, you go straight to paradise. You get 70 black virgins, perfumed virgins, who are all yours. The tree of, the divine tree of life, which stretched, I think, 150 miles or something like that. All of this mythology that came in paradise, it was Bilal. Bilal brought the azan, the calling of the azan, the call to prayer and all that. Now, there is some question as to whether the Prophet Muhammad was a literate man or not. There is question to that. Now, there are many Muslims that will argue you down, but there is a question about that. But getting back to it, this new force rising was a refreshing force. Many of the Jews embraced it because the Eurocentric Christians had been oppressing them. But this force now began to, it started out good, like most religions do, but once it became a religion of the state, it became an orthodoxy. And when it becomes an orthodoxy, it means you can only believe what has been defined and accepted by that organized religion, and anything beyond that is not tolerated. It means your mind cannot go beyond that. It puts a ceiling, a cap on your intellect and your intellectual growth. The Christians had done that. The Roman Christians had done that with orthodoxy, but they were burning people at the stake for being heretics. The Muslims now began to do this after the death of Muhammad, the prophet, and it became a state religion eventually. Their thing was conquest, and they went to spread Islam not with prayer but with the sword, just like Christianity was spreading with the sword. And they attacked the African Christians next door to them at Aksum, and then they went on and attacked in Egypt, and they went on to attack in other places. And these Africans, in trying to fight off these Arab attackers, began to call upon the Byzantine emperor to help them, saying, we are Christian brothers after all. Prior to this time, the Africans had paid very little attention to the European Christians. They said, we need your armies to help us, so let's fight these off. This struggle goes on for several centuries. It is in 1096 that Urban I, Pope Urban I of the Roman Catholic Church, is invited by the Byzantine emperor to come help them fight the Muslims, because the Muslims is kicking everybody's butt. Everybody took Persia, they'd taken Constantinople, and they just taken everything in their path. I mean, they were throwing down. They were warriors, and they were driven by the fanaticism of their belief. You know, you tell a man that if he dies in battle, and that every battle is a jihad and a holy war, if he dies, he's going to get 70 jet black versions, he going to fight hard. So this is a very difficult thing to combat. I mean, it's the psychology like this. So they psyched up, man, when they go into battle. When they go into battle, Allahu Akbar, man, that was a hard thing to reckon with. Plus, the Christians were not as skilled as them. The Muslims were more agile, and their horses were faster. The Christians had these knights with all this heavy armor on, and they were crude fighters. Well, they were getting their butts kicked, and they called on the Western Roman Christian Empire. And they called on them to come for help, and that's when Pope Urban I, in 1096 of the Common Era, went throughout the land preaching crusade. And the purpose for the crusade, because they couldn't get them when they first sent the letters and asked them, they wouldn't go. And so the Byzantine emperor said, but there's a lot of money in it. If you come here and help us, you can open up the trade door with India, Persia, and China and the East. You don't have that trade now. And you're all over there dying from all kind of sickness and diseases, and all the medicines you have are over here in the East. Y'all need, your food is spoiling, all the things you need to preserve your food and to give spice to your food, so you're eating maggots every day. They were. The meat was going bad, and they were eating maggots and worms every day. Said, all you need to stop that is right here in the East. And we've been controlling it, but we're going to let you have some if you come in here and help us get these Muslims off our back. So Pope Urban went throughout the land preaching crusade. That was the first crusade in 1096. And that was the beginning of going to Palestine, because the Muslims controlled Palestine at that time. And they built the mosque to Abraham and things to Hagar and all that stuff there, and to Ishmael. Then the European Christians come in and decide that they are going to make this a holy land for them, and they start building their little churches at what they say is where Jesus was born. Now listen to this. This is in 1096. Jesus is born somewhere between who knows, 4 to 10 BCE. It's about 6 to 10 years off. We don't know exactly when it was. So this is what, over 1,000 years later, almost 1,100 years later, that they are now going to a place they have not been for millennia and start picking out landmarks and calling them and saying, this is where Jesus did this, we're going to build a church here, and he did this here, we're going to build a church there, this is where Abraham went, we're going to build a church here. This was also at the same time that they began to sell splinters from the cross that Jesus was crucified on. They sold so many splinters from the cross that they say Jesus was crucified on, it could have sunk 10 ships. That's how many splinters they sold. They even went so far as they were selling hair from the head of Peter. They were selling nipples from the bottle that Jesus was suckled on. Nobody suckled a child with a bottle in those days. Not in Israel. They suckled from the breast of the woman. They sold so many foreskins from the head of his penis that was supposed to have been found there at the Temple of Jerusalem. There was no Temple of Jerusalem. It happened, the Romans had rebuilt the city and called it Capitolina something, I forget now. Anatolia Capitolina, I believe it was called. Anatole Capitolina. And it was nowhere like what it had been before. It is not the same Jerusalem. It had been totally destroyed. You couldn't find that stuff there. They didn't have the sophisticated archaeologists you have today who could go excavating that stuff. They didn't have that. They didn't have that kind of knowledge. So they just went there and picked them out some places and began what they figured was a general place where he had been. And they started building churches there. And they picked those places that the Muslims had been building their mosques because they were trying to take that power from them. Keep in mind, they used the religion as a force to motivate the people, but the objective was economic and for political control. And that's how all this thing about the Holy Land and all this imagery of white people, Eurocentric imagery, you will find when you go there today in these various churches in Bethlehem and in different places there. However, at the very same time, the most sacred icons in all of Christendom, and particularly in Europe, was of the Black Madonna and Child, and can be found in churches all over Europe even to this day. The head of Christendom, of Roman Catholic Christendom, the Pope himself, John Paul II, when he goes to bed at night, prays to the image of a black woman and child, and they call Mary and Jesus, Black Madonna and Child, and when he wakes up in the morning, the first thing he does is pray to this image of this black woman and child. And the first things he did when he was installed in the office of Pope of Rome was to take money from Rome and put it into the refurbishing of the church in Poland of the shrine of the Black Madonna. Now these Black Madonnas are considered to be magical, and they bring them out every Easter and parade them among the people, and the people pin money on them and believe that they can heal them, but they keep them hidden away the rest of the year. And at the same time that they do that, on the other hand, they put all this white imagery around in these churches in the Holy Land, and consequently, our people, not knowing their history or the history of the place, will go there thinking that Jesus and the disciples and Mary and Joseph look like these images that these Europeans put there. And by the way, even when the Crusades started, and it went about 12 or 13 Crusades, and the Muslims beat them every time they went. Even during that time, they weren't using the white imagery. The white imagery did not really come to the fore until the days of Michelangelo, after they had driven the Moors out of Spain. It was at this time, the last stronghold of the Moors was in 1492. The Kingdom of Granada, January the 2nd, Christopher Colon was standing there with his hand out, waiting for the money. Once they had conquered Granada, once Abu Abdullah surrendered his sword while his mother cussed him out, by the way. His mother cussed him out, called him all kind of punk faggots, all the way to his retreat for giving up. She said, you should have died in battle. You shouldn't have given this up. He surrendered his sword to Isabella and Ferdinand. Cologne was standing outside on January the 2nd waiting for some money so he could make this voyage over here in October. Now, with that, the Europeans had been so devastated psychologically by the overwhelming brilliance of the Moorish Empire, which was 80% African and 20% Arabs, and the Arabs were mixed. They were so overwhelmed by it that they were now in an identity crisis and were seeking to find an identity for themselves. And that's when they began to commission works. That's what Pope was that? Pope Leo, was it? That commissioned, or was it Pope Julian? It's either Leo or Julian, I get them mixed up here, who commissioned Michelangelo to paint his aunt, uncle, and cousins as the first family. And that was the beginning of the European imagery, Eurocentric imagery, of putting what had been known throughout the history even of the European church, that these were Africoid people, that these were black people, and now began to put this imagery in the context of white supremacy. And they put it into those churches, and that was the beginning of the spread of the imagery of white people as the founders and promulgators of the original movement founded by Jesus, which came to be known as Christianity.
I have several questions to ask you, but I just went and saw that Ethiopian Zion, which is a display of religious art supposedly coming out of Ethiopia. And the majority of that art is of a European Byzantine depiction of Jesus the Christ, and it's very confusing for our people because they're hurting our children that deceive us. And in the history, the outline of history, they're taking the Ethiopian empire of Axum back to around 30 AD, somewhere around there. So people say, well, these are Ethiopians. They are some of the oldest Christians, and if they're painting Jesus white, surely they must have known what he's doing.
They're the oldest Christians because that's where the Christian church developed in Africa. But the point that it must be remembered, when they called on the Byzantines emperor to help them fight against the incursion of the Arabs, when they called on, they had to pay a price for that. They called on this man to bring his army in, and that's when the influence of the Byzantine art and the Byzantine Empire was exerted upon the Ethiopians. But their oldest icon, their oldest images, the further you go back, you will find them to be more Africoid. But as you get on till about the 6th, 7th century, as you start coming up in there, you will see this Byzantine influence, and you will see these mixed people largely there. So that's how that came about.
Let me go back to the religion that Jesus is supposed to have. Let's talk about that for a while. I want to start with Abraham. What religion did Abraham have when he became a Hebrew? Even to the time that he went into Egypt, was it a one God-centered religion, or did he essentially come out of Egypt with that one God concept and all of the other essence that later became Christianity?
Okay, what has made it so confusing for people is that Africans generally always had a one God concept. I don't like the term God because the word spelled backwards, but I'm using it out of convenience now. As Willis Budge says in the book, what he calls the Egyptian Book of the Dead, actually it's the book of coming forth by day or by night. In his translation of it, he begins in his introduction to state that these people in Kemet practiced essentially what was a polytheistic monotheism. And what does that mean? They believed in the one, for whom they never built a temple. They never had the audacity to say that they could fit it in the temple. They never said they had all the knowledge of it between the pages of their books. Now, Christianity claims that, Islam claims that, other religions claim it. They were so in awe of it, they said you cannot understand this one, which they saw as the divine intelligence, the permeator of everything in the universe, called the Neher-Nu. But you can see so many manifestations of this force in the different deities which Europeans call gods and goddesses. They were just different aspects of the one. Now, this was generally common among African people throughout that region. Now, mother reverence was the strongest religious system in the world at that time. And the maternal aspect of the Creator was emphasized because of the role of the black woman, the significant, very significant role, overwhelmingly significant role of the black woman in the creation of civilization. So that existed in Canaan. But the Hebrews somehow became more patriarchal, or the priests did. The prophets, became more patriarchal, and there was a constant struggle between the prophets and the priests, because the priests leaned towards the mother goddess religions, and the prophets wanted to put the emphasis on the father. So there was always that struggle, and that's why the prophets were so vehement in all of the venom that they wrote about the mother goddess religion, and accused them of doing all kind of ugly things, which they did not do essentially in their practices. Now, Abraham, in all probability, because the prophets had not really grown, there were no prophets in Israel in that time, there was no Israel. Abraham, the first Harabu, or Hebrew as we call it, was following the religion that everybody else was following at that time, which was the mother goddess religion. They were all, and they had many manifestations of the one divine force in the universe. They didn't have many gods, they just had many manifestations of that force. Now, when he came, we don't even know if Abraham even had any understanding about a one God concept as we think of it today. They say he had that understanding, but that understanding was only made clear in the days of Moses. And Moses was merely carrying on that which he had been taught in the school of philosophy that he studied while he was in Kemet, which was the school of Atan, founded by Akhenaten, in the days of Akhenaten, who they say was the inaugurator of monotheism. It is not true. He just had another name that he gave to the sun. The Kemetans, the intelligent Kemetans, did not believe that the sun was God or the Creator, but that it was the most visible manifestation of the God force for the solar system. That was scientific. I mean, when the sun goes out, God and everything goes out for you, because the sun is the regulator of everything here. So they saw the provision for this planet and the solar system of the Creator, of what we must name a God, through the sun. And they called it Amun-Ra. And the priest of Amun-Ra was so strong for so many centuries, and therefore they controlled the government. They controlled the pharaohs, and the pharaohs had to come through them. But when Akhenaten comes along, he was going to buck all this, and this is over several thousand years old, and come up with another name, and still the sun now, as its central symbol, and call it Atan. And he's trying to reverse a political order. And the priests of Amun are too strong for him to do this. But he is not the inaugurator of monotheism. Moses obviously followed in that school. Dr. Ben, to use his words, he said, what happened between Moses and Ramses II during the 19th dynasty of Kemet? Moses being raised as a brother of Ramses II, being raised, according to the biblical story, by the pharaoh Setai I, jet black man. His daughter's jet black. His son, Ramses II, is jet black with kinky hair. So Moses is raised as a son, and that, which gives you another indication that he's a black man. Dr. Ben said what happened, to use his words, two niggas fell out over God. Ramses II said, Amun-Ra. Moses came up with this thing about El Shaddai, the Lord of the mountain. So they got in a struggle over that. Now, whether Moses was asked to leave, whether Moses was put out, this whole story about Moses going to the Pharaoh and saying to him, going to Ramses II and saying, let my people go, that's not recorded anywhere else but in the book of Exodus. If a whole army, like they say, that the Pharaoh's army died in the Red Sea, a whole army in the most powerful nation on the earth at that time had been drowned, it would have been carved in stele all over the literate world at that time. Persia was literate, India was literate, Babylon was literate. All of those were literate nations. It would have been written in all those nations. The Greeks at that time were not literate. There was no Rome at that time. You know, there was no Greece actually at that time. No European nation. There was no European nation. It was only tribes. None of them were literate at the time. But in every literate nation would have recorded something as significant as a whole army of the greatest ruler in the world, the ruler of Kemet, drowning in the Red Sea. If 3 million people had walked up to the Red Sea and Moses lifted up his staff and it parted, you would see that carved in stone there today. That's an awesome and a magnificent thing that would not have been unnoticed. It is only recorded in one place, in the book of Exodus. Just like the enslavement of the Hebrews is only recorded in the book of Exodus. Throughout the whole history, Dr. Ishakamusa tells us, of Kemet, which the Bible calls Egypt, there were no more than 30,000 slaves. And they were people, mostly Eurasians, who had landed and did not act right. So they were made to work and pay for the wrong they had done. Instead of throwing them in jail, they put them to work. They made slaves out of them, servants. But there were not more than 30,000 throughout the whole history of the Khmeran Empire, which might have been as old as 18,000 years when you go back, if you put it at the founding of agriculture, which the story says Osar and Osset founded in the Nile Valley at the founding of agriculture, which dates back 18,000 BCE. Now, Egypt did not exist off of a feudal system, and you have to have a feudal system for slavery to go. They were not like the Romans or the Greeks. They didn't depend on slavery for their labor. The pyramids were not built by slave labor. They were built by contract, and they got records of the contracts there. This was contracted work. People built it and enjoyed building it. They built it while the Nile was inundated because they couldn't plant at that time, so they did something else. They built pyramids. But there were no slaves, certainly no Hebrews built them. The pyramids were built so much longer before Abraham came. The Great Pyramid of Giza could be, it's at least 7,000 years old. By the time Abraham got there, it was about 4,000 years old. So it wasn't but a few people with him, so they couldn't have built it. When Moses' people come on the scene, there, it's about 1,200 years. So they didn't build anything there. They were not enslaved there. Now, it could have been possible that this in the book of Exodus gives us a key, say we have to do something about their birth rate because they may join our enemy when they come. Because the Hebrews, even though they were Africans, were known to be wishy-washy. They were with the Africans if the African was in power, but if the Asian came in, they joined the Asian. So they would go betwixt and between. They were not black people you could depend on. They only went for themselves, and they were very small people. But this is before they become a nation now. They're down there. They're not even a nation. They're still loosely scattered tribes of descendants of 12 sons of Jacob. And then Moses, for whatever reason, leads them out of there. They're going into Palestine. They get into Palestine. Moses dies. Joshua commits genocide against the people at the city of Jericho. That's genocide. They take land from another black people, the Canaanites. They take it. They take it in the name of their God. Say, God sent me to take this land from you. That's genocide. That's an act of genocide. There's no way you can justify it whatsoever. They said, well, we took it because you're a heathen. The Hebrews bowed down to other gods. Even Abraham, when he wanted Sarah to get pregnant, she didn't get pregnant, he went and got him a teraphim and put it under his pillow, as a symbol to the great goddess of the universe to make his wife pregnant. So he was still into that. Moses, when the children of Israel were in the desert and were bitten by the serpents, he didn't tell them to go pray to God. He put a brazen serpent, if you remember the story, up on a pole and told them that everybody that looks up to this will be healed. That's a form of idolatry. That's a form of imaging. So now when the Hebrews accused everybody else of being heathens, they were doing the same practices. They did it throughout Israel. They were not as significant as a nation in the days of Moses, even in the days of Joshua. They after Joshua took them into the land of Canaan, they spent another 200 to 400 years, we're not sure on what the period is, probably 200 years, with intertribal battles. You read the book of Judges. And they're constantly killing one another. When one of the other surrounding Canaanite nations doesn't come in, the Jebusites and Amalekites, and subdue them, and they constantly have to get liberators to get them from up under them. They do not become a nation until about 1000. This is over 200 years after Moses leads them out. To about 1000 BCE. In the days of King Saul, they get a king, but they're not an actual nation. It is in the days of David that they begin to take some form of nationhood. And it is in the days of David that they start to exterminate the indigenous people there in Palestine, known as the Canaanites. They begin to exterminate them. The Bible even says that according to their story, God commanded David to go down and kill everything that pisses against the wall. That's in the Bible. That's, I believe, in 1st or 2nd Samuel. 2nd Samuel. Man, woman, child, and cattle. Kill them all. That's how crude it was. That's how awful and horrifying it was. St. Augustine, one of the founders of the African Christian Church, said, if you believe the book of Genesis and the Old Testament, and you take it literally, you are attributing to God things unworthy of him. Because those acts were acts of human beings and their atrocities against one another. These were black people hurting black people. Wasn't even no white folks in it at that time. White folks weren't strong enough to do any real invading of the land at that time. They were hitting on the outskirts of things, but they weren't able to kick up any dust at that time. The Scythians had been beat back up into Europe, so they didn't have the strength to do it. So now they become a nation around 1000 BCE, but nobody even cares about them, nobody recognizes them to this one period that is outstanding in their whole history. And that is the period when Solomon is king. And Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop said that, and that is the only time that Israel is recognized in world history. And the reason why Solomon, who was about 960, he comes on the throne, and he reigns according to Kings, the book of Kings, he reigns for 40 years. The reason why Solomon has such prominence in the world and makes Israel prominent is because of world trade, and also the women he married. Most of the women among his wives were out of Africa and from African nations.
Well, let's talk about Solomon in terms of, was he an African? What at that time?
He, in all probability, was an African because the Hebrews were Africoid. They were dark-skinned people. They were black people. Let's face it. They were Kemetans and Cushites. They were all mixed up. And then they were mixed up with Canaanites. So they were black people. There had been no significant incursion of white people in the land at that time. So they weren't mixed like that. They were very much maintaining their color, their original color, which was a mahogany color. They were very dark people. Solomon was a dark man. Most of the women he married were dark-skinned women from dark lands. And their women came from places that possessed a lot more knowledge than Israel did. Israel was not a literate nation. They were not a scientific culture. All these sciences were brought from other lands. And when he brought these women in from these high culture lands, then they imparted to him knowledge which made him appear so wise. But the story about Makeda, the queen of Sheba, going to see Solomon because he was wise is the way the Hebrews wrote it. Dr. Ben corrects that for us and tells us that she was going to check on one of her tributaries because Israel had to pay tribute to Cush, because Cush was mighty at that time in the land. So that's what she was going. Now, while they were there, it's possible they had a love affair. It's possible they hooked up and had what they call Menelik the First born out of it. But she was by no means subordinate to Solomon. And if anybody was awed and mesmerized by somebody's wisdom, it was probably Solomon being mesmerized by the wisdom of Makeda, because she came from the land where the women were renowned for their clairvoyance and their insight. In fact, most of the pharaohs, all of the strong pharaohs in Kemet, always made sure that their principal wives were from the south, from down below the first cataract, down in Cush in Nubia, because those were the most insightful, clairvoyant women, the women of great wisdom. And so Makeda, she was a queen, a Kadaki, a queen in Sheba. So I mean, that is one of the oldest empires in the world, the Kushite Empire, or the Nubian Empire should be called. She was a queen there, so she had a lot more knowledge than Solomon. It was the priest out of Africa who went to Mount Carmel and set up the temple there. Solomon's temple was an extension of the mystery school out of Waret, or what the Greeks called Luxor. It was an extension of the school. It wasn't Solomon who originally, and that's one of the things that made him famous. It was the first time that anything like that had been set up in all Israel. And it was then that writings began to come into the land from other lands, because they were not producing any writing themselves. People think that at the time that when they write in the Bible about what David did and what Solomon did, that there were people writing it at the time it took place. No, this was written hundreds of years after the fact. And as a historical reality, there wasn't any significant writing on the part of the nation of Israel until after they were taken captive by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar in the year 587 BCE. And that's when the priests decided they had better come up with a literary work, but they didn't have any jobs anymore. Because there was no temple for them to start. Jerusalem was destroyed that time by Nebuchadnezzar, and it took several centuries for it to be built up. All the priests of Israel knew how to do was to make sacrifice and to do the incantations. The priests of Kemet were scientists. Not only could he do the ritual, he either was an architect or a mathematician or astronomer or something, or physician. In Babylon, there were astronomers, physicians. So in Israel, they could only do one thing, like a lot of preachers today. That's all they could do, was do the incantation and make the sacrifice. But they could not do anything other than that. So when the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BCE, they didn't have no jobs. And here they were in Babylon in captivity, and so they had to come up with a way to keep the people coming, because the people now were going to the Babylonian priests because they had more to offer. So that's when they began to write a history of Israel in a religious context. And that's when the story in the book of Genesis, the stories in the book of Genesis about the creation of the world began to be written. And it took, after they began to write it, took some 1,500 years before they finally completed it to the form that we know it today. They started in 587. It wasn't until before the Common Era. It was in 90 CE that the Hebrews decided, that the Jews decided at the Council of Jamnia, 20 years after the destruction of their capital, that they were going to now codify the Old Testament and set the canon for it, the books that would go in it. That's when it was decided. Then it took another, how many years, the Council of Nicaea, that they decided to bring in a New Testament. There was no New Testament when Jesus was alive. There was no New Testament when the apostles were alive. In their letters to each other, they had no idea that people were going to look at them as sacred scripture. That was just like you and me. You and I writing a letter to each other. we had no idea that some people were going to come along later and say, this is the Word of God. You know, that wasn't even thought about. This was later that the Europeans decided that the Old Testament of the Hebrews was not enough for them. They needed something else. And that's when they began to develop a New Testament or Christian literature, and they incorporated the Old Testament into it. And that was not finalized until, good Lord, about, I'd say about 1400 of this era. And of course, in the days of King James in 1611 of this era is when they put the cap on it, when they were making the translation into the Anglo-Saxon tongue. So what we're looking at here, that is being projected to us as coming from God out of heaven and descending on the earth, as being sacred and divine, is the creation of human beings, mostly European human beings, cast in their image, so that we can always think of them as sacred and divine. So that deep in our psyche somewhere we will always think of the white man as God. As one tape, well, who was that scholar speaking, the historian, on the tape by Gorey Island, when he talked about the fact that the white man made us call him master. And master is the term you use for your creator. Therefore, in calling him master, you're calling him God. And actually, in the New Testament, when they did that translation in King James version in 1611, slavery was beginning, the English were beginning to come into the slave trade then. And that's when they put those texts in there about slave, obey your master. Obey your master as unto God, pleasing him in all things, no matter what he asks you to do. And even if you can get freedom, don't seek after it, because free or bondman, we are all slaves in Christ. They put all those kind of texts in there at that time. It is doubtful that the Apostle Paul wrote those things in his letters, and if he did write them, no wonder he was hated by the Hebrews, because he certainly wouldn't have been accepted by them if he was telling them to slavery of the Romans, and even if you can be free. In fact, he took, according to one letter of Philemon, he sends a slave back to his master after he escaped. So Paul, if he did in fact write those things, could not have been a friend of mine, or been a friend of Jesus even. And we must keep in mind that Paul never met Jesus. Paul never walked with Jesus. He never heard Jesus. And he was in the desert for 3 years in the Arabian desert, and he came back with a revelation of his own, which the apostles were not in agreement with. So that even today there's a saying, robbing Peter to pay Paul. And that's where that came from. But Paul went to the Europeans. He went to Greece, he went to the Romans, and he collected money. The Nazarene movement, like the black nationalist movement today, is always broke. So they called them to Jerusalem. They said, what you're teaching isn't the book of Acts. It's not right. Jesus didn't teach that. But Paul said, I got this money from there. So they said, well, teach what you want to then, and just as long as you, because we know what Jesus was about and what this is about. You can tell the white folks anything you want to tell them. You can tell those folks in Greece and Rome anything you want to tell them, as long as you can bring this kind of money up in there. And on his way to Jerusalem, when they called him in, at the council there, when the apostles who had traveled with Jesus called Paul in, it took him almost a year to get there, because he stopped in every city and picked up some money to take to the church at Jerusalem. And when he got there, he had all this money, and he laid in front of him, and the brother said, well, you know, he said, well, I'm the apostle to the Gentiles. They said, you sure are. With that kind of money, you're the apostle to the Gentiles. We are the apostles to Israel. We're teaching the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Because Jesus has said, go not into the way of the Gentiles, but go only unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, how did this thing get spread all over in Greece and Rome and all that? Paul came up with his own ideas and concepts, and at first they were going to fight him on it. But when he brought that money in there, they said, you're doing a good job. Send him all back out there. Send a dude with him. Send Barnabas with him. Barnabas with him. First time, and then the next time he went out, Silas went with him. But they didn't mind sending him on those missionary journeys, because every time he made that tour, he came back with money. But it undermined the movement, because Paul was a true wannabe. He wanted to be a Roman more than anything else, and the other thing he had going for him, he could speak and write in 7 different languages. It is doubtful that any of the apostles were literate, with the exception of maybe Matthew, who was a civil servant. So he worked in the tax department, so he was probably literate. He was a tax collector. He worked in the Bureau of Internal Revenue there, so he probably had some literacy to him. But the others, Peter, James, and John didn't. They were fishermen. They were bammers. They were wharf dudes from off the wharf, man. They didn't feel a need to have that literary education. They made their living from the sea. So that's how they dealt. All of the others were laborers. So you only had that one that we know of that was an intellectual, and maybe Judas Iscariot may have been literate. Now here comes Paul, that can write, has been to several universities, the University of Tarsus. So that's why his letters in the New Testament, you have the 4 Gospels. Out of the 27 books in the New Testament, you got the 4 Gospels. 13 letters of Paul dominate the New Testament. 13 of them. And the Gospel of Luke and the Acts were volume 1 and volume 2 of the history of the Christian church that was being written by a friend of Paul's who was a Syrian Greek named Luke, who was a physician. And because Luke and Paul were so close, Paul comes out to be a hero in the book of Acts. And Luke, therefore, in the year 140 CE, John Marcion, a European Christian, says that the Old Testament is just too crude. The God of the Old Testament is too violent. I can't deal with him. I can only deal with the gentle Jesus. And that's when he took the Gospel of Luke and the letters of Paul and said, this is the Word of God. But it wasn't until 325, almost 200 years later, that it became official. And it couldn't become official until you had the state power, the army of Constantine to back it up. And that's how you get the unadulterated Word of God, the New Testament. It does not exist in Jesus' day. It does not exist in the Apostles' day. None of that. Matthew could or could not have written. This looks like it was some Egyptian out of Egypt who wrote the book of Matthew. The book of Revelation has all that Kemeton imagery in it. So it was probably written there. Hugh Schoenfield does a very good job about that in the formulation of the New Testament. In that book, The Incredible Christians. So I guess, in essence, that kind of gives us an overview of how a land that originally started out, going all the way back maybe 50 to 70,000 years, with Africoid peoples in it, remaining primarily Africoid throughout the ages, even when Abraham came and settled there, even when Moses and the children of Israel went there, who were black themselves and mingled with black people there. Throughout the development of the kings, throughout the development of its nation, there after they had committed genocide against other black people, it was still a black nation. It is only, even when the Babylonians came, even when the Assyrians came and took them into captivity, it was still a black nation. They do not begin to be all mixed up until the Greeks come. Even when the Persians came, they remained a black nation. It's when the Greeks come now that they begin to have a mixture, and when the Romans come, they begin to have a mixture. They're still essentially a black race, so that by the time that Jesus arrives on the scene, it's still predominantly a black people, definitely a people of color like ourselves today. It is only after the destruction of Jerusalem and the Romans scattered them in the year 70 CE that we now have these light-skinned people coming back in the settled land. In fact, that's what the Romans settled, repopulated the land with, the Eurasians there, after they had run the black folks out of there. And those people you see there today are not the original indigenous people. They are people who came from other places. and settled there.